Your hosts for this episode are Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, and retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Jorge Serafin, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of the Americas. This is the Indo-Pacific Visions Vodcast, a product of Air University Press.
Appreciate your time, and we're looking forward to diving a little bit deeper into the material that you provided to us for your article, The Expanding Leverage of the People's Republic of China in Latin America, which highlighted the surprising breadth and scale of China's influence in Latin America. And we were hoping that you'd be able, in your view, to tell us what are the most concerning aspects of China's activities in the region.
Well, thanks, Doc. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today and to kind of expand on some of the things that maybe I couldn't fit into the article or ideas that I've continued to develop since. I think it's difficult to highlight a most concerning activity in the region. I think it really comes together as a sum of multiple parts. It's my personal opinion that China's activities across the globe were part of let's call it a well-nested campaign plan to reorder the world order, as Elizabeth Economy would say. In Latin America, you see that play out with multiple lines of effort. And if I were going to categorize them broadly, I would categorize it as efforts to dominate the information space, to include the information technology backbone, the energy sector to include things like power distribution, key lines of communication, specifically with some major port facilities, those that could be used to dominate trade routes, but also to, in the right future conditions, maybe for dual basing, and as well as the space infrastructure. So in space infrastructure, those facilities could have dual purposes for military purposes as well.
Good afternoon, sir. Indeed, I'll reiterate Dr. Rockwell's opening comments. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to obtain your perspective today. We'll start with, can you expand on the level of threat that China's growing implementation of police/security systems and space facilities in Latin America specifically pose to the exfiltration of critical defense, economic, and personal data from the region?
Yeah, I think I'll expand that even beyond the police systems, although that definitely plays a role. I see two potential things at play here. First, the elites of the Chinese Communist Party are trying to export their model, and by exporting their model, change the rules of the game. Those police systems are part of that. They have a very tight information control environment and kind of an autocratic model of behavior control, population control there in the People's Republic of China. In a region that's challenged with instability and security control concerns, violence, transnational criminal organizations, exporting this tight information control environment, the monitoring everything is a very tempting solution. But beyond that, from a security perspective, this equipment and information backbone that goes with these types of systems, the safe cities with the cameras, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G networks that are built not to current international security standards and may be vulnerable to exploitation by PRC entities. As you know, there is a law in the PRC that requires even private Chinese companies to provide intelligence to the government when requested. That backbone, that information backbone, becomes a intelligence threat in itself. And when you think about the amount of information, from banking accounts to private information to your emails and phone calls that flow over that background, that is a major security threat from a coercive standpoint. With regards to space, one of my concerns is the potential dual use of some of these facilities. So a lot of the space infrastructure that the PRC has sponsored or partnered with Latin American and Caribbean governments to in place in the region is there ostensibly under civil purposes. But it's clear from publicly available sources the People's Liberation Army is involved in some of these facilities, and they could have dual use purposes for tracking or targeting U.S. space infrastructure for military purposes.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, sir, in your article, you mentioned China's use of economic entanglements, critical infrastructure investments, coercive diplomacy, and information control to gain leverage over Latin America. Could you expand on how each of these tactics undermines U.S. interests and regional sovereignty?
Sure. I think I'll kind of return to the overarching themes, which is when you control the information and the information infrastructure, when you control key resources, when you control lines of communication, and when you control critical infrastructure to include the energy sector or power distribution, you have what amounts to almost a perfect coercive engine. And that coercive engine in combination means that this authoritarian government with a record of imposing its will on what you can say or what you can do, both internally and externally, is increasingly gaining the means to do that in the Western Hemisphere in multiple nations. And so that means you could influence things like political decisions, what happens on international bodies, access to resources, access to lines of communication. That undermines sovereignty, and it undermines sovereignty for those nations, it undermines sovereignty for those nations who would like to make decisions in the interest of their own populations rather than the interests of the elites in Beijing. But it also undermines U.S. interests in the region simply from the standpoint of we have deep relations with Latin America. We have deep partnerships and friendships. We're dependent or let's say heavily interested in trade and resources with Latin America and the Caribbean. And we rely on these like-minded governance for support in international bodies. So if those coercive mechanisms are allowed to take full hold, then potentially we lose both access to resources and influence in international bodies or friends in international bodies.
Following up, do you believe that the Chinese courting of Argentina as one of the big three powers in the region, together with Colombia and Brazil, is meant to establish a foothold to usurp the U.S. position as the regional hegemon? How serious is this threat?
I think that the PRC is attempting to make inroads at multiple places in the region. Not just Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, but also you see it, they're active in places like Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, maybe places that are less friendly diplomatically to the United States. I do think, as you point out, that it is concerning to see the inroads the PRC government is making and PRC entities are making with the major political and economic powers in the region. Argentina, I believe, is part of that effort, but not exclusively in that effort. And of course, the environment ebbs and you see changes in the environment depending on the political status in the region. Right now, the Malay government in Argentina will probably be more pro-U.S. Than the previous government, but it's hard to say. They just President Malay just took office. His public statements certainly indicate that, and you'll see some shifting back and forth as you would in any democratic nation. So I do believe, in short answer to your question, that the PRC is absolutely trying to increase its influence in the region, and Argentina is part of that equation.
Thank you.
And sir, how can the United States, work multilaterally with allies in Latin America and further afield to address the shared concerns about China's ambitions?
Well, the first thing I'd say, Doc, is that, we have to come at this with a great deal of humility. These are sovereign nations. They have significant challenges that they're trying to address for their populations. And there's history here. The U.S. history is not spotless in Latin America. And so as we seek to work with our partners, I think the first thing we got to recognize is that these are sovereign nations with their own sovereign interests, and they're trying the best they can in many cases, most cases, to meet those interests. And that includes potentially sometimes they're doing essentially geopolitical math that says, hey, I need to meet for my population. What's my best way to meet it? It may even, some of them in their calculus may even say, maybe it's not good to get myself caught between two elephants by picking a side. Maybe I need to triangulate between the major powers at play here. That being said, I think the best thing that we can do is first illuminate the risks, be very open and transparent about why we think that there are risks involved with partnering with the PRC. There are plenty of open source examples of why the PRC can be a risky partner. I think the other thing that we can do is make ourselves available. We're not always the easiest country to partner with, meaning that for things like, let's just say, sales of military equipment, our foreign military sales process or foreign military finance process can be very, very slow. We have to speed those things up so that we become a viable option to meet our partners at their point of need.
Yeah, that's been a problem throughout the Indo-Pacific as well. It's one of the things I harp on about our relationship with India all the time. We lost them because of that, the military acquisitions way back in the beginning of the Cold War, and we're still struggling to supplant Russia and other nefarious characters because of that. So that's a very good point.
Yeah, I think that spans across our interagency, Doc. I'm not certain that we have yet calibrated ourselves as a whole of government really towards the idea of a strategic competition with the international rules-based order and the future of our nation as the item that's at risk. We have a very bureaucratic set of systems and processes, and we're going to have to work as a whole of government, from individuals all the way through the legislature, to focus ourselves on being ready to meet the challenge.
Roger that.
How can the U.S. help build our allies' military institutional capabilities? For example, how can we capitalize on U.S. SOCOM's recent efforts in assisting Chile in establishing their own joint force initiative?
Well, I think being there as partners, present on the field, to work with our partners across the theater is really a great first step. You want to build trust is the number one foundational issue, and trust requires contact. It requires information sharing. It requires working towards one another. With that, we can share doctrine and ideas. Here's how we did it. Chile is going to need to put a uniquely Chilean spin on how they build their joint structure, but certainly our lessons can help provide a guide for possible ways forward. The other thing that we can do is really work hard on interoperability, also through sharing doctrine, but exercising together, working together, continuing the exchanges that we do. Relationships really, I think, become foundational. And I'll return back to the foreign military sales, foreign military financing, excess defense article process. All these processes we want to make as fast as possible for our partners across the globe, and as well as in Latin America, because they have defense needs and they're going to look for wherever they can to fulfill them. If the United States can't be fast enough to meet point of need, then it's a significant detriment for our interests and for our partners, who may have to turn to a less desirable source.
Indeed, sir. And the feedback that we receive is exactly that, that they want more personal relationships at all the echelons of leadership in order to build that trust. And that was crucial in the joint initiative that SOCOM did with their own forces. Thank you.
Yeah.
So building on that, my last question is, in what ways can U.S. Southern Command and 12th Air Force in particular support Latin American countries as they face China's coercive diplomacy, debt trap lending, and information warfare?
Well, we could do all sorts of things, Doc, but I think the number one thing we can do is first to build the trust that's required to open our partners' willingness to hear the next part of the message, which is to illuminate the threat. And that's a tricky proposition. You know, it's very easy for us to go to our partners and say, hey, this other actor, whether it be China or Iran or Venezuela or Russia or whoever it may be, this other actor doesn't have your best interests at heart. Don't partner with them. It's kind of the lecture phase. We've got to tell them why. We've got to give them alternatives. And we have to, be present and helpful in trying to help our partners solve their problems. Because if all we have to offer is a lecture, then we're probably going to fall short.
And the old adage, don't come to me with a problem that you can't solve.
Right.
Yes, sir. And for our final question, we'll go back to the space topic. How should the U.S. work with our Latin American partners to counter the threats posed by China's expanding Latin American space footprint? Are there opportunities for space security cooperation between us and our allies?
I think this is a bright spot for us. I think that, perhaps we are a little bit behind the pace of growing PRC space infrastructure in Latin America. But we have a lot to offer in space. And I think there's tons of opportunities for partnership. I'll give you one example. Joint Task Force Space Defense under U.S. Spacecom has the Joint Commercial Space Operations or Joint Commercial Operations Space Initiative. And the who does what to whom is a little complicated even for me. Probably too complicated for me to try to describe it, especially since that organization is in the process of being changed right now. But under Joint Commercial Operations, you can have multiple partners contributing to the space domain awareness effort that allows for free access and safe access to space, monitoring what's going on up in space to include looking for strange activities that might be taking place as different nations maneuver objects around in that domain, as I understand it. So, but the bottom line is it's training, it's skill sets. It helps build our partners contribute to this international effort for the peaceful use of the space domain. There are international agreements like the Artemis Accords, which relate primarily to space exploration out to the moon, asteroids, other bodies in the space in between cislunar space. There are signatories to that set of agreements that are in Latin America. Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Ecuador are the ones that come to mind immediately for me. So we can kind of come to not only a international understanding of how space should be used, but we can define rules and norms and call out folks that don't adhere to those rules and norms. And I think there's enormous opportunities to just work together and build capability, whether it be basic space domain awareness techniques and skill sets, or how to use the capabilities that are out there. Again, going back to the commercial operations, things like commercially available imagery that can be helpful in meeting the needs of population in time of crisis, whether it be related to a hurricane, an earthquake, flooding or drought, in addition to things like climate concerns or identifying threats like illegal mining, deforestation, or even someday as things speed up, you might be able to get after the predatory fishing fleets, the illegal, unregulated fishing that go, or unreported fishing that goes on in our partners' exclusive economic zones, primarily by PRC fishing fleets that conduct incursions into those areas and really take a lot of resources away from the populations of those Latin American and Caribbean nations.
Thank you, sir. As an old space guy that worked on the last 3 GPS launches, that is music to my ears, because we saw the same thing with the GPS program when it first came out, and the immense impact that it has had on the civilian side of the house and commercialization. So great news. Thank you.
Yeah, and correct me to 100% if I got the organizations wrong there. I still struggle to get the acronyms exactly right.
We all do. Thank you.
Sir, that brings us to the end of the pre-canned questions, but we wanted to provide you with ample opportunity to discuss, topics that we may have missed that may be of interest to you to address. And one of the things that we would ask you to do is think about some of the topics that you would like to see us publish on in our journals that would be of benefit to your organization as you move forward to implementing some of the concerns that you've talked about today.
Yeah, I think, Doc, thank you for that opportunity. I think the thing that I try to struggle to articulate a little bit sometimes, and what the genesis of this article is why Latin America matters in an era when we are focused on the Indo-Pacific from the standpoint of a pacing challenge of the People's Republic of China. Why does Latin America and the Caribbean, the Southcom AOR, why does it matter? And so, from that standpoint, the competition is global, and we can't ignore the Western Hemisphere. It is not a given. In fact, I think it could be a point of strategic weakness for democratic governments, like-minded democratic nations, if we take what's going on in the Southern Hemisphere, the southern half of the Western Hemisphere, for granted. So I'd reiterate the primary things that the mechanisms that I'm most concerned about are things like communications infrastructure to include control of information infrastructure, 5G networks being the most recent, cloud computing, places where information is at risk, intelligence risk from safe city projects, but also efforts to intimidate journalists or to influence the public positions of politicians or governments using multiple means of coercion, whether it be economic or otherwise. The critical infrastructure, we talk a lot about critical infrastructure, but don't necessarily talk about why critical infrastructure matters. I really focus on the energy sector, although it's bigger than that. That energy sector, things like the fact that PRC entities, which may be private, but I think it's relatively well known that these private entities are increasingly subjective to political requirements by the Chinese Communist Party, anything from gathering intelligence to maybe other types of decisions. Bethany Allen writes a little bit about this in her book, Beijing Rules. That energy sector, talk about a coercive mechanism. If you control the power, I read one source that about 56% of the power distribution in the nation of Chile is controlled by PRC entities. That's a little scary. Lima, I was doing some reading in media sources that said that PRC entities or commercial entities had been on the verge of controlling 100% of the power distribution to the capital of Peru. That's a little scary. So good communications infrastructure, power infrastructure, lines of communication, specifically ports, is where I would put the right now the most obvious concerns. You control a major port project like the new one going into Peru. I think I can't remember the name of the city, but there's a mega port going in on the west coast of Peru. There, you're not only controlling, building the new monopoly on a commercial flow of goods, but potentially you're building a future military base. Those types of port projects are all over the Latin America and the Caribbean. I think there are ports built by and operated by Chinese entities in places like Jamaica, the Bahamas, Colombia, Peru, Argentina. They're all over the place. And, potentially they could even one day in the right political environment host warships that can threaten things like the Panama Canal or Straits of Magellan, the Drake Passage, or all of the above. And hey, you don't even have to host a warship to do that. The Chinese have shown a willingness to use those type of port operations in other places of the globe, kind of as a mechanism of coercion or punishment, by simply letting goods rot on the dock. So if you have a Chinese company that's operating the port infrastructure, the cranes, the cargo handling, not only potentially those things could be turned into an intelligence threat, but they are potentially a mechanism of control or coercion down the road. So those three things are the ones that concern me the most: communications, energy, and infrastructure, like lines of communication, like the ports. But you could add in control of critical resources, like monopolization of critical minerals, the lithium triangle, and the vertical monopolization of the supply chains. So there's a lot of mechanisms there. And then, the one thing that I didn't talk about yet was this idea of strategic corruption. You mentioned it in your question. There's a lot of articles and studies that have started to point at the idea that PRC entities, sometimes commercial and private entities, risking little punishment or taking advantage of corruption or unfair businesses practices to get no-bid contracts, win concessions, get political decisions like permission to build a space station at the local level, using things that the United States would just outlaw, but can be gotten away with in the current environment in Latin America. So all that stuff builds to really what I think of as a whole of government, well nested. I don't think it's extraordinarily well synchronized sometimes, but well nested effort to do exactly as Elizabeth Economy said, and is to set the conditions to reorder the world order.
Very well stated.
Thank you, sir.
Anything else you'd like to talk about? I
think you got everything that I had in my head.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, sir. It's very much a pleasure. We look forward to future opportunities to work with you and your team in getting the word out about a lot of these issues, some of which we were able to address in the issue where you were published in, and some of which remain to be driven home with our readership. We do with our journals. We are trying to wake people up and provide voices, not just from those that are in uniform and in government, but from academicians and think tankers and whatnot that kind of give us some support for what we're trying to, as you mentioned, tell our allies and friends in the AOR that hey, some folks don't have your best interest at heart, and while we may have a checkered past, we should have a bright future as friends. So we welcome future opportunities to work with your team to get that message out.
Absolutely. I think there's a perception still that this is just about economics, and it may be authoritarian government, but it's really about economics and economic interest and resource security. I think to a certain extent that's true, A lot of these efforts started out with that as the first objective, economics and say supply chain security, things like food. But I think under the current regime, they've certainly continued to expand in their scope, scale, and ambition, and that it's far bigger than economics, and that's what the a good percentage of the United States public may and certainly the public in our partner nations may not understand.
Roger
Yes,
that.
sir. And from our part, sir, please feel free to use us as your voice box. Throughout the years, we have sponsored the students as they come in, exchange students as they come in through ACSC and through
Great.
War College, and we maintain those links as they progress through their ranks. A lot of the folks that we have sponsored are at the 3- and 4-star level in our allied partners, air forces. For example, General Bueno, my assistant, used to babysit his kid, and he just retired probably a little bit more than recently, but as the CSAF for Colombia. So those are the type of readers that we have, and we can do targeted messaging, and we're at your disposal as you see fit.
Okay. Hey, thanks, Jorge. I think that, sometimes we undervalue the links we have to those international students and who they will become. So I really think it's an asymmetric advantage for us. The Chinese still are now starting to try to mimic that a little bit by bringing folks over for PME and a little bit of probably indoctrination. I don't know exactly what they go through, but it tends to be, as I understand it, they get segregated out. They don't mix with their with the officers from the People's Liberation Army. And as you know, there at Maxwell, we have everybody right in there together, and it's a great opportunity to build that trust and mutual understanding. I think it's an asymmetric advantage that we have that maybe we under-resource sometimes, because the appetite is huge in our partner nations, and I certainly think those networks that you have are extraordinarily valuable.
Thanks, sir.
Thanks, sir.